It was just another quiet morning at Golden Valley, a small truck stop nestled on the edge of nowhere. But the air, heavy with diesel fumes and the scent of fresh coffee, held a tension that would soon shift everything into high gear. Jack Reeves, a seasoned veteran of both the military and the open highway, was doing what he always did, checking his rig. His hands, weathered by years of experience, moved with practiced ease over the truck's vital components. Every touch and adjustment a silent conversation between a man and the machine he'd trusted for hundreds of thousands of miles. Jack was no stranger to the road, but that morning something felt different. The early sun bounced off the chrome of his Peterbilt 389, casting glints of light over the polished surface. He ran his fingers along the side of his truck, feeling the coolness of the metal, the familiar texture of the machine that had carried him through rain, snow, and every challenge the road had thrown his way. He wasn't in any rush. His delivery of medical supplies, bound for Carson City, wasn't due until the afternoon. So Jack took his time, listening to the hum of engines coming to life around him, watching the familiar rhythm of truckers preparing for another day on the road. Each of them, like Jack, knew that the highway was more than just a means of transportation, it was a lifeline. The parking lot slowly began to fill with the usual crowd of truckers, each one with a story, each one with a purpose. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the distant chatter of drivers filling up at the pumps, while the comforting sound of engines starting up filled the background. In the diner, Sarah, who had run the place for years, was behind the counter, expertly pouring coffee and exchanging pleasantries with the regulars. The sound of laughter mixed with the clinking of coffee cups, but beneath the surface an undercurrent of tension began to build. Jack couldn't place it, but he could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just another quiet morning. From the distance, the unmistakable roar of motorcycles began to grow louder. It started with a low rumble, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew into a deafening thunder as the bikes neared the truck stop. Jack's instincts kicked in. He'd spent years in war zones and had learned how to read a situation before it even fully unfolded. His muscles tensed, his mind racing as he scanned the horizon, picking up on the subtle cues that told him this wasn't just a passing biker group. No, this was different. These bikes weren't cruising through on a leisurely ride. They were here with intent. The noise grew louder, and Sarah, always alert to the comings and goings of the regulars, noticed it too. She looked out the window, her expression shifting from calm routine to the kind of watchful focus that came with years of running a truck stop in a place like Golden Valley. She'd seen her fair share of trouble over the years. She knew the difference between just another group of bikers passing through and a group that was here for more than just fuel and food. These guys didn't look like ordinary riders. They were methodical, deliberate. They had a swagger to them, an air of menace that was impossible to ignore. The group of bikers pulled into the lot, their engines roaring as they lined up in front of Sarah's diner. There were 6 of them in total, each one wearing the unmistakable patches of the Steel Serpent Motorcycle Club. Jack watched them dismount, their boots hitting the pavement with a synchronized thud, each one looking like they had just stepped out of a movie about dangerous men on the edge of society. The leader, a tall man with a silver streak in his beard, stepped forward, surveying the truck stop with the cold eyes of someone used to getting what they wanted. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he just stood there, looking around, his gaze lingering on Jack's rig for just a moment too long. Jack didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. The bikers weren't here to make friends. They had a reputation, and Jack knew all too well what kind of trouble they could bring. The Steel Serpents weren't just a local biker gang. They were part of a larger, darker network that ran along the highways, preying on anyone who was weak enough to let them. Jack had seen their type before, both on the battlefield and on the open road. They were bullies, nothing more than a collection of men who used fear and intimidation to get what they wanted. They had no respect for the road or the people who made a living on it. As Jack stood there, watching the bikers move with slow, deliberate steps toward the diner, his mind began to race. The young driver nearby was struggling with his trailer, visibly frustrated as he tried to align the coupler. Jack knew the kid was green, still learning the ropes. He could tell the kid was scared, his eyes darting nervously between the bikers and his rig, unsure of what to do next. Jack walked over without hesitation, his boots crunching on the gravel. The sound of his footsteps seemed to cut through the rising tension in the air. The young driver looked up, his face a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "Need a hand?" Jack's voice was calm, steady, with a hint of authority that came from years of experience. The kid wiped the sweat from his brow, looking grateful but unsure. "I can't get this damn thing to line up right," the kid muttered, frustration clear in his voice. Jack didn't say anything more. He just moved to the back of the trailer, calmly showing the kid how to align it properly. With each step, Jack's hands worked with precision, guiding the young driver through the process with the same care he would have shown if he were stitching up a wound in Afghanistan. He had the same focus now as he did back then, calm in the face of pressure, methodical in every movement. The kid watched him closely, clearly impressed by how easily Jack made it look. "Thanks, mister," the young driver said, holding out his hand. "You make it look easy." Jack gave a small smile, shaking the kid's hand. Everyone was new once. Just take your time. Do it right. As the two of them stood there, the first rumble of motorcycles echoed again from the highway. Jack didn't need to look up to know that the Steel Serpents were back in the lot, making their presence known. This time the rumble was louder, more persistent. It was unmistakable. Jack's body stiffened as he felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. Something was coming, something he couldn't ignore. The bikers weren't just testing boundaries, they were starting to make a move. Inside the diner, Sarah watched the bikers with a practiced eye. She had seen enough to know that these weren't just some guys on bikes looking for a meal. They were trouble. The way they moved, the way they carried themselves, spoke volumes. Jack could sense it too. Something was off. It wasn't just a typical stop on the road. The Steel Serpents weren't just passing through. They had come to stake a claim, and Golden Valley was the target. Jack could feel the tension growing, not just from him, but from every driver in the lot. This was about to get a lot more complicated than anyone had expected. Jack made a mental note. He needed to be ready. The highway had always been about survival, about knowing when to fight and when to back off. But this time, he had a feeling that backing off wasn't an option. Not today. Not when the stakes were this high. Jack glanced once more at his truck, the rig that had carried him through countless miles and countless battles. Today, it might just be more than a truck. It might be his fortress. And as the bikers continued to crowd the diner, Jack knew this was the beginning of something much bigger than anyone realized. This wasn't just a fight for Golden Valley. This was a fight for the open road itself. The morning sun gleamed off the polished chrome of Jack's rig, casting long shadows across the lot. But despite the sunlight warming the ground, there was a chill in the air, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. Jack could feel it in his gut. Something was coming. The sound of engines, powerful and relentless, drew closer, their roar echoing down the highway. At first, it was just a faint vibration, a distant hum. Then, as it grew louder, Jack's eyes narrowed. He didn't have to look up to know who was approaching. It wasn't just a few riders passing through. They were coming in force. The unmistakable rumble of a motorcycle gang. The Steel Serpents. They'd arrived. There was no mistaking it. As the bikes pulled into the lot, their chrome frames reflecting the sunlight, Jack's body tensed. 6 riders in total, all dressed in black leather, each with the distinct patch of the Steel Serpent Motorcycle Club sewn across their backs. The leader, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard, moved with the confident swagger of someone used to taking what they wanted. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept the lot, taking in every detail. He didn't care about the trucks or the drivers. They were just pawns in a much bigger game. His gaze locked on Jack's rig, studying it for a moment, sizing up not just the truck, but the man behind the wheel. Jack stood tall, his eyes meeting the leader's gaze for just a brief moment. It was an unspoken challenge, a silent communication between two men who understood that power was never given. It was always earned, and it was often taken. Jack's mind raced through the possibilities. These bikers weren't just here to cause a scene. They were here for something, and it wasn't just a random pit stop. They had a purpose. They were marking their territory, and Jack had the sinking feeling that they weren't going to leave until they had it. As the bikers dismounted, their boots thudding heavily against the pavement, Jack kept his distance, assessing the situation. The leader, whose name Jack would later learn was Razor, stepped forward first, his eyes never leaving the truck. Jack remained unfazed, but the tension in his body was palpable. He knew what was coming. He'd seen this kind of intimidation before. Razor's gang wasn't just a bunch of rowdy bikers looking to pass the time. They were an organized force, a group that operated on fear and intimidation. And right now, they were looking to see just how far they could push before someone fought back. The leader's voice broke the silence. "Nice rig," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Jack didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. He had already sized up Razor and his gang, and it was clear to him that this wasn't just idle chatter. This was a test, a way to see if Jack was going to bend under pressure. "Military man, huh?" Razor asked, his eyes glinting as he took in the veteran's sticker on Jack's truck. "You haul medical supplies, right?" he continued, his voice taking on a more menacing edge. "Valuable stuff, that." Jack didn't flinch. He had spent enough time in the military to know when someone was trying to rattle him. He wasn't about to let Razor or his gang see that they had hit a nerve. "Just doing my job," Jack said calmly, his voice steady. "Nothing special about it." He wasn't going to let the bikers provoke him into a fight, but he also wasn't about to let them push him around. This was his world, the world of long highways, endless miles, and the tight-knit community of truckers who lived by a code that didn't bend to the will of bullies. Razor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Jobs can be dangerous these days," he said, running a hand along the polished surface of Jack's truck, his fingers lingering a little too long. "Lot of hijackings out here. A shame if anything happened to such a nice rig." His words were a thinly veiled threat, the kind of thing that Jack had heard countless times before. But this time, there was something different in Razor's tone. The threat was real. The gang wasn't just here to intimidate, they were making their move. Jack didn't rise to the bait. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply shrugged. "Appreciate the concern," he said, his tone cool and detached. "But I've been on this road long enough to know how to handle myself." He could feel the eyes of the other drivers on him, could sense the collective tension in the air. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire trucking community, a group of people who had spent years on the road together, who knew how to read a situation and knew when to stand their ground. The other bikers had begun to spread out, taking their time as they moved through the parking lot. There were no loud threats, no immediate acts of violence. It was a methodical approach, a slow, deliberate display of power. Jack could see the other truckers, the regulars, watching from a distance, waiting to see how things would unfold. They were all aware of what was happening. They could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just an idle encounter. The steel serpents weren't just here to pass through. They were here to take control. As Razor and his gang headed toward the diner, Jack stayed by his truck, his mind working fast. He wasn't going to let these bikers take over his home, his route, or his livelihood. But he also knew that things couldn't escalate into an all-out confrontation. Not yet. The trucking community was tight-knit, yes, but it wasn't invincible. They needed to be smart. Jack's experience as a combat medic had taught him that sometimes the best way to deal with a situation wasn't to fight head-on. It was to wait, to watch, and to understand the enemy's next move. Inside the diner, Sarah was already working the counter, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She'd seen trouble before, and she knew how to handle it. She moved between the tables, topping off coffee cups, her quiet demeanor hiding the sharpness of her mind. She could sense it too. The bikers weren't just stopping for a bite, they were making a statement. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and without skipping a beat, she picked it up. The sheriff was on the line. She knew he was stretched thin, and with these bikers moving in, there wasn't much he could do. But she also knew something had to be done, and fast. As Sarah continued to move around the diner, the tension was palpable. Drivers who had been sipping their coffee and exchanging small talk grew quieter. Their eyes flicked toward the door, toward the bikers, and then back to each other. The Steel Serpents weren't just here to stir up trouble. They had come for something. And if the truckers didn't act soon, they were going to find themselves on the losing side of a fight they hadn't asked for. Jack stayed in his rig, his eyes trained on the entrance of the diner. He wasn't going to be rushed into a decision, but the longer the bikers stayed, the more Jack realized that this wasn't going to be an easy situation to navigate. The Steel Serpents had tested the waters, and now it was up to Jack and his fellow truckers to decide how far they were willing to let things go. They'd always been a quiet, unassuming group, tough, reliable, but largely invisible to the world outside. But now, that silence was about to break, and Jack could feel the shift happening. The battle for Golden Valley had begun. As the day stretched on and the bikers settled in, Jack's mind raced. The tension in the air was no longer subtle. It was a pressure that everyone felt, from the youngest driver to the most seasoned veteran. The trucks in the lot, once a collection of scattered rigs, now seemed to be grouped together, their drivers standing just a little bit taller. They weren't just truckers anymore. They were a community, and they weren't going to let these bikers walk over them, not without a fight. And Jack was ready. The Steel Serpents had made their presence known, and with every passing minute, the tension at Golden Valley truck stop grew thicker. The bikers had not come here for food or rest. They had come with a purpose. Jack could feel it in his gut. Their arrival wasn't just about a pit stop. They were staking their claim on this place, testing the waters, looking for weakness. Jack wasn't about to give them one. Inside Sarah's diner, the usual hustle and bustle had shifted into something more subdued. The clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation remained, but there was a certain sharpness in the air that hadn't been there before. Sarah moved around the diner with practiced ease, her eyes never leaving the bikers. She had been running this diner for over a decade, and in that time she had seen all sorts of trouble. But something about this felt different. The bikers weren't just passing through, they were here to send a message. As the bikers settled into a corner of the diner, their loud voices and boisterous laughter filled the space. But it was a different kind of noise than the usual morning chatter. This wasn't the carefree banter of road-weary truckers sharing stories. This was the aggressive posturing of men who believed they could take what they wanted. Sarah could feel it too. She kept a close eye on them, moving about the diner, but never straying too far from the counter. Her fingers brushed against the coffee pots as she refilled cups, but her mind was working in overdrive, calculating the situation, trying to figure out the next move. The Steel Serpents had drawn attention, not just from the truckers in the lot, but from everyone around. The message had started to spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before the regulars, those who had been coming to Golden Valley for years, began to whisper among themselves. There was a heaviness in their voices, a quiet determination that matched the collective awareness of the danger they were in. This wasn't just a fight for territory, it was a fight for their way of life. Jack sat in his rig, watching through the windshield as the bikers continued their slow march around the lot. They weren't rushing, they were taking their time, letting their presence be felt, deliberately marking every inch of the truck stop as theirs. The leader, Razor, made his way to the diner, his steps deliberate, like he was walking into his own domain. He paused just before stepping through the door, scanning the lot one last time, his gaze settling on Jack's truck. It was a look of approval, like he had just spotted the prize he was after. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but he didn't move. There was no need to make the first move. Not yet. Razor had made his, and now it was Jack's turn to decide how to respond. Inside the diner, the other truckers were starting to show their concern. They had seen it before. These gangs, moving in, trying to take control of the roads and the places they stopped. But they hadn't expected it to happen here, not at Golden Valley. The truck stop had always been a refuge, a place where drivers could relax, share a meal, and swap stories without fear of being pushed around. Now, as Razor and his crew settled into their booth, the air had shifted. No one was sure what the next move would be, but everyone knew it was coming. There was a sense of quiet solidarity among the regulars, a subtle but undeniable shift in how they were looking at each other. They had been in tight spots before, but never like this. Never had they been faced with a group that seemed so ready to break every rule, to push as far as they could. The first rumbles of motorcycles outside echoed in the distance again, louder this time, signaling the arrival of more bikers. Jack's instincts flared as he leaned forward in his seat, his eyes tracking the movement of the riders. There were more of them now, at least a dozen, maybe more, all pulling into the lot and parking with military precision. They moved like a well-oiled machine, each rider knowing exactly where to park, where to go. Jack felt a sense of urgency begin to pulse in his chest. This wasn't just a few bikers causing trouble. They were organizing, positioning themselves for something bigger. Jack didn't know exactly what, but he had seen enough to know that trouble was on the horizon. At that moment, Jack's CB radio crackled to life, the familiar voice of another driver cutting through the static. "Ghost Rider, this is Bobby," the voice said, low and serious. "Got eyes on more of these bikes heading your way. Keep your head down, Jack. This ain't just another biker gang. These guys are organized. Stay alert." Jack's grip on the radio tightened as he processed Bobby's warning. Organized. That was the word that kept coming back to him. The Steel Serpents weren't just a random group of troublemakers looking to raise hell. They had a plan. And they were using Golden Valley as the first step in executing it. Jack's military training kicked in, and he started thinking like he would if he were back in the field. The strategy was the same: watch, wait, and be ready to act when the time was right. The bikers were probing, testing boundaries, and Jack wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react to their intimidation tactics. The young driver who had been struggling earlier with his trailer coupling reappeared at Jack's side. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "You think these guys are serious trouble?" he asked, his voice shaky. Jack gave him a steady look, his face unreadable. "Trouble's what you make of it," he said quietly. The kid seemed to appreciate the answer, even if it didn't give him the reassurance he was looking for. Jack put a hand on his shoulder, giving him a silent nod to finish his work. Inside Sarah's diner, the bikers were still making their presence felt. They weren't making any direct moves just yet, but they were laying the groundwork. Their leader, Razor, sat at the head of the table with his crew, his eyes scanning the room like a predator watching its prey. He had already marked Jack's truck as something valuable, and it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. The steel grip of tension continued to build in the diner as the regulars stayed close, watching from the corners of the room. They had no love for the bikers. They had seen enough of them to know what they were capable of, but none of them were willing to make the first move either, not yet. Jack stayed in his rig, his eyes focused on the diner entrance, his mind running through different scenarios. It wasn't just about defending himself or his truck. It was about the community, the network of drivers who relied on places like Golden Valley to stay safe, to rest, and to share the same unspoken code that kept the road running smoothly. The Steel Serpents had just made a big mistake. They hadn't just targeted Jack. They had targeted all of them. And the moment they had done that, they had ignited a spark in a community that was about to show them just how far they were willing to go to protect their own. Razor's eyes flicked toward the door again, his gaze locking briefly with Jack's. The unspoken exchange between them was brief, but loaded with meaning. Razor, for all his swagger and arrogance, knew that Jack wasn't just another driver. He had underestimated him before, and now he was starting to realize that he wasn't dealing with someone who would back down easily. Jack had seen enough of the world to know when things were about to take a turn, and this time he could feel the weight of the moment settling in. Golden Valley wasn't just a truck stop anymore. It had become the battleground. The sun was starting to climb higher in the sky, but the sense of unease at Golden Valley was palpable. Jack Reeves sat in his rig, hands firmly gripping the steering wheel as his mind raced through the possibilities. The steel serpents had been here long enough now, and Jack could feel the weight of their presence hanging over the truck stop. These weren't just any bikers. These were men who operated with ruthless precision. Jack had dealt with criminals before, in both his military career and on the highways, but there was something about this group that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. They weren't just here for a meal. They had come with a plan. He'd seen it in their eyes, heard it in the quiet, deliberate way they moved, in the way their leader, Razor, had sized him up from the moment he laid eyes on his rig. Jack's experience in combat had taught him the importance of reading a situation before it erupted, and right now he could feel the storm gathering on the horizon. The Steel Serpents were no ordinary gang. They were organized, methodical, and they weren't making idle threats. They had an agenda, and it wasn't just about asserting dominance at a truck stop. Jack could tell they had bigger things in mind. He had spent enough time on the front lines of wars, seeing the slow burn of tension that built up until it eventually exploded, to know that the bikers weren't just here to hassle truckers. They were testing the limits of what they could get away with. And Jack, along with every other driver in the lot, was starting to realize that they had a choice to make: stand up to this threat, or let it roll over them like every other bully that had ever tried to control the roads. Inside the diner, Sarah continued to work, though her movements were now more deliberate. She wasn't just serving coffee or filling orders anymore. She was assessing the situation, just like Jack. Over the years, she had seen all kinds of trouble pass through Golden Valley, but this was different. The Steel Serpents weren't here to just make a scene or start a fight. They were here to intimidate, to claim ownership of the space, to break the spirit of the people who made a living on the highways. And as Sarah watched them, she could see the way the other truckers were reacting. There were no outbursts yet, no overt displays of aggression, but there was a subtle shift happening. The eyes of every regular in the diner were on the bikers, their faces a mix of suspicion and readiness. The tension was thick, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before something would break. She had always prided herself on running a tight ship, but this wasn't just about keeping the diner running smoothly anymore. This was about survival. The bikers weren't just a nuisance, they were a threat, and Sarah wasn't about to let them take control of her home. Outside, the rumble of motorcycle engines had become a constant background noise. More bikes rolled into the lot, their riders moving with the kind of precision that told Jack this wasn't just an impromptu stop. It was a calculated move. The bikers weren't just there to eat, they were marking their territory, letting everyone around them know that they were in charge now. The sight of more bikers arriving only heightened the sense of danger in the air. The gang had expanded its presence, setting up a perimeter of sorts. Jack could see them out of his side mirror, positioning themselves at key points around the lot like they were preparing for a standoff. Every movement was deliberate. They weren't just bikers, they were soldiers in a war, and Golden Valley was their first battleground. Jack's mind, however, was elsewhere. He thought back to his time in combat, the lessons learned in places far from here. He had been in situations like this before, where the pressure mounted and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The key to surviving, to winning, was to be patient, to let the enemy make the first move. But patience had limits, and Jack knew that if the Steel Serpents pushed too hard, the time for waiting would be over. They would cross a line, and when they did, Jack and the rest of the truckers would have to be ready to fight back. The young driver who had been struggling with his trailer earlier appeared again, looking even more anxious than before. The kid wasn't used to dealing with threats like this. He was still green, fresh on the road, and Jack could see the fear in his eyes. "You think they'll make a move?" the kid asked, his voice trembling. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he just studied the young man for a moment, taking in his nervous posture. He could feel the tension in the air, could see how it was affecting the others. This wasn't just a biker gang, it was an infection spreading through the truck stop, making everyone on edge. But Jack wasn't about to show fear. He'd learned long ago that fear was a weakness. It was a vulnerability that people like Razor would exploit. "Trouble's what you make of it," Jack finally replied, his voice calm, almost reassuring. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. It was a reminder that the situation was what they made of it. If they stood their ground, if they didn't bend to the bikers' threats, then they could control the narrative. But if they showed any weakness, if they allowed the bikers to take the first step toward aggression, then everything could spiral out of control. Jack placed a hand on the kid's shoulder, giving him a firm but gentle squeeze. "Keep your head on straight," he said. "Don't let them see you rattle." The kid nodded, though his eyes were still wide, his hands shaking slightly as he returned to his truck. Jack watched him go, his thoughts still spinning. He had seen it too many times before, the fear, the hesitation. The first few minutes of an encounter like this could define the entire outcome. But Jack wasn't about to let fear take hold, not this time. Inside the diner, the bikers had started to make themselves more comfortable, taking up space in the small corner booth as if they owned it. Razor, their leader, had started holding court, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, but not in a way that invited conversation. It was all about power, control. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make everyone listen. His very presence was enough to command the room. He wasn't just talking to the other bikers at his table. He was sending a message to everyone in the diner. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to dominate. Sarah kept her distance, but her eyes never stopped moving. She was keeping track of everything, the way the bikers held their posture, the way they looked at the truckers, the way Razor's voice carried over the room. She knew exactly what was happening. The bikers were trying to assert dominance, trying to break the spirit of the drivers who made this place home. They had done it before at other truck stops, and they were going to try it here. But Sarah wasn't the type to let that happen. She had run this diner for years, watched as drivers came and went, seen every kind of trouble imaginable. But none of them had been like this. None of them had come with this kind of cold, calculated intent. Jack's mind was still running on high alert. He knew that this wasn't going to end in a few minutes. Razor and his crew weren't going to just pack up and leave after a few tense exchanges. They had come with a plan, and if they thought they could take over Golden Valley without any resistance, they were sorely mistaken. Jack had spent too many years learning how to stand his ground. He wasn't going to let some bikers walk in and take it all away, not without a fight. The question was no longer if things would escalate, it was when. The radio crackled to life again. "Ghost Rider, this is Bobby. Got a report from a fellow driver down Route 40. Same bikers heading your way. Looks like they're setting up for something bigger. Stay sharp, Jack." Jack gripped the radio tighter, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. More bikers were coming. The gang was expanding its reach, getting bolder with each passing minute. They weren't just trying to take over the truck stop. They were laying the groundwork for something much bigger. But Jack was ready. The game was changing, and he had no intention of letting the Steel Serpents win. Not today. Not on his watch. The pressure was mounting. The bikers were making their move, and it was clear to Jack that the tipping point was fast approaching. The time to react was near. The question was, would they wait until the bikers crossed the line, or would they make their stand first? Jack knew it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire trucking community, and that meant one thing. They had to stand together. Whatever came next, they couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The sun hung high over Golden Valley, casting long shadows across the parking lot as the morning routine continued, though now there was a marked tension in the air. The Steel Serpents had settled in, and their presence had begun to alter the usual rhythm of the truck stop. Every trucker who came through could feel it. They weren't here for a quick bite or a rest. They had come to make a statement, to take what they wanted. Jack had seen it all before, back in the war zones, where every move had to be calculated. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was a truck stop. Still, Jack knew that the same rules applied. Never underestimate your enemy, and never let them know how much you're watching them. He sat in his rig, watching through the windshield as the Steel Serpents made themselves comfortable, spreading their numbers through the diner and around the lot. There was no loud confrontation, no aggressive posturing, at least not yet, but there was a subtle threat in every movement, in every word. Jack's eyes tracked their leader, Razor, who had made a habit of surveying the lot with the cool calculation of someone who believed he could control everything he saw. The man wasn't just looking at trucks or drivers, he was sizing up the entire operation, trying to gauge the weakness, the place where he could strike. And Jack, with the calm of someone who had been in enough life and death situations to know that patience was often the key, kept his focus on the bigger picture. This wasn't just a standoff. It was the beginning of something larger. These bikers weren't the type to give up easily, and they weren't just out for a quick score. They had set their sights on Golden Valley for a reason, and Jack needed to figure out what that reason was. The diner's regulars were still eating, still chatting, but Jack could feel the undercurrent of anxiety running through the room. Sarah was keeping busy, moving between tables, but her eyes never strayed too far from the bikers. She had run this place for years, seen every type of trouble, but these bikers weren't like the others. There was a certain menace in the air that hadn't been there before, something about the way they carried themselves, the way they moved like they were waiting for something to unfold. Jack had been in enough scrapes to know when it was time to act and when it was time to wait. Right now, it was a waiting game. As the bikers settled in, their laughter and loud conversation filling the diner, Sarah made her way behind the counter. She wasn't just refilling coffee mugs. She was watching, listening, gathering information. She knew the signs, knew how to read a room. She had a sharp eye for trouble, and everything about the bikers told her that this was more than just a random encounter. This was part of something bigger. The bikers weren't here for a meal, they were here for control. The thought sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Golden Valley wasn't just any stop, it was the beating heart of the highways, a place where truckers from all over the country came to rest, to share stories, to bond. The Steel Serpents had no business here, and Sarah wasn't about to let them take what was hers. Jack's mind raced as he continued to watch the bikers. He had seen their type before, men who lived on intimidation and fear, who thought they could push around anyone they pleased. They were here to take over, but Jack wasn't going to let that happen. He had learned long ago that the key to survival in any situation was to be ready, and right now he was preparing. The bikers had come with a plan, and Jack had to figure out what it was before they made their next move. He could hear the rumble of more motorcycles approaching, the sound growing louder as the day wore on. They weren't just leaving, they were reinforcing their position. The young driver who had been struggling with his trailer earlier reappeared, looking even more anxious. The kid was new to the road, and Jack could see the fear in his eyes. "Do you think they'll make their move?" the kid asked quietly, his voice laced with uncertainty. Jack looked at him for a moment before answering, his voice calm and steady. "Trouble's what you make of it," he said, giving the kid a reassuring nod. The young driver wasn't sure what to make of it, but Jack knew that the key to surviving this situation was staying calm. Panic never helped anyone. Jack had faced bigger threats, had been in worse situations, and he knew that the way to win was to keep a level head. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted. The regulars were still talking, but their voices were quieter now, their glances more guarded. They knew something was coming, and they knew that if they didn't act, they would lose what little control they had left. The bikers weren't just making idle threats, they were laying the groundwork for something bigger. Jack's eyes scanned the lot, watching the bikers spread out, taking strategic positions. They weren't just trying to make noise, they were positioning themselves for something more. The Steel Serpents weren't here for a quick hit, they were here to take over. They were slowly establishing their dominance, making sure that everyone knew who was in charge. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack's thoughts turned to his fellow truckers. They weren't just drivers, they were a community, bound together by years of shared experience on the road. But the Steel Serpents didn't see it that way. To them, the truckers were just obstacles in the way of their goals, pawns to be moved around at will. Jack had been on the road long enough to know that the only thing that mattered when things like this happened was standing together. This wasn't just a fight for Golden Valley, it was a fight for the entire community of truckers. The bikers had made a grave mistake by thinking they could roll in and take whatever they wanted without facing resistance. But Jack knew that resistance wasn't just about fighting back, it was about standing firm, about making sure that the threat didn't get the satisfaction of seeing fear in their eyes. The bikers were getting bolder by the minute. Jack could feel it in the way they moved, in the way Razor's eyes scanned the lot, looking for any sign of weakness. The gang had been here long enough to know that this wasn't just a random stop. It was a critical point in their operation, a place where they could establish a foothold if they pushed hard enough. But Jack wasn't going to make it easy for them. He could hear the buzz of the CB radio as other drivers began to check in, reporting sightings of more bikers on the road, more signs of their growing presence. The Steel Serpents weren't just targeting Golden Valley, they were setting up a network, a system to control the highways. And if they were going to succeed, they needed to break the spirit of the truckers, make them feel like they had no choice but to back down. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen, not while he still had breath in his lungs. The more the bikers pushed, the more determined he became. He had seen too many men break under pressure, seen too many people give up what mattered most because they were afraid to fight. But Jack knew that the only way to win this fight was to stand his ground, and that's exactly what he was going to do. The Steel Serpents had made a big mistake by thinking that Golden Valley was a place they could just take over. It wasn't just a truck stop, it was a symbol, a beacon of the community that thrived on the roads, and Jack wasn't about to let that beacon go dark. The afternoon wore on, and the bikers continued to reinforce their position. Jack could feel the time drawing near, the moment when something would snap, when the bikers would make their move and the truckers would have to decide whether they would bend or break. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that when the time came, they would be ready. They had to be. This was bigger than just one truck stop. This was about standing together, about making sure that the highways remained free, that the people who lived on them could continue to drive without fear of being pushed around. And Jack was ready to fight for that. All of them were. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a golden glow over Golden Valley Truck Stop. But the heat in the air wasn't coming from the fading daylight. It was coming from the tension that had been building since the morning. The Steel Serpents had dug in their heels, and every trucker at Golden Valley could feel it. The bikers were here to stay, and it wasn't just about claiming space on the lot anymore. It was about pushing their way into a place they had no right to be. Jack had seen the way they moved, the way Razor and his crew carried themselves with the silent knowledge that they could get away with whatever they wanted. But Jack wasn't having any of it. As the day wore on, more and more drivers showed up, each of them seeing the same thing, a quiet war brewing in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't just a group of bikers causing trouble for a few drivers. They were coming for something bigger, and they had no idea who they were messing with. Jack sat in his rig, eyes fixed on the lot, his mind running through possible scenarios. The bikers had been circling the diner, casting long, lingering glances at the regulars, trying to get a feel for who might be an easy target, who might be afraid to stand up to them. But Jack had never been one to back down, and the other drivers knew that too. They weren't ready to be pushed out of their own home, not without a fight. There was something about the way they all gathered in the diner now, about the quiet solidarity in the air, that told Jack the time for hesitation was over. It was time to act. Inside Sarah's diner, the usual hum of chatter had slowed. No one was speaking louder than necessary, and eyes flicked from the bikers to the door, the windows, the other truckers, everyone watching, silently sizing each other up. The bikers were still taking up space, but there was an undeniable shift happening in the room. Every trucker in there had spent years on the road. They had dealt with rough patches, long hours, bad weather, and a million other obstacles that tested their resolve. But they hadn't signed up to be intimidated. This wasn't just about their rigs. It was about their way of life, their community, and they weren't going to let anyone walk in and take that from them. Sarah moved between tables, her usual fluid grace now tinged with the edge of alertness. She had been through countless close calls over the years, but this felt different. The bikers weren't just here for food or a drink. They were here to establish dominance, to send a message that Golden Valley was theirs. She could feel it in the way they carried themselves, in the way they watched the truckers like predators watching prey. But Sarah was no stranger to the games these kinds of men played. She wasn't about to let them take her diner, her home, without a fight. Outside, the engines of more bikes roared into the parking lot, louder now, as though more bikers were arriving to reinforce their claim on Golden Valley. It was like a slow tide of muscle and leather, each new engine an unmistakable sign that the bikers were preparing for something. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the lot, his mind calculating the movements of the bikers. It was clear now, they weren't just passing through. This was a calculated move, one that would play out over time. Razor's gang wasn't acting like a group of random thugs. They were working with purpose, with coordination, and that was what made them so dangerous. Jack's hand tightened around the CB radio as another transmission came through. "Ghost Rider, this is Bobby. Got reports from Route 42. More bikes coming in. Looks like they're forming up. They're not just here for a pit stop. They're staging something. You're going to need backup." The urgency in Bobby's voice was clear. Jack's pulse quickened. He had been hoping the bikers would get bored and leave, but now it was obvious that they weren't going anywhere. They were setting up a stronghold, marking Golden Valley as part of their operation. But Jack wasn't going to wait around for them to make the first move. He was done sitting on the sidelines. This was his fight, and it was time to take action. Across the diner, Jack could see Sarah moving behind the counter, her sharp eyes tracking the bikers. She wasn't saying anything, but Jack could tell she was ready. The word was spreading now, through the quiet murmur of conversation, through the subtle movements of the drivers. Everyone in the diner knew the same thing. They couldn't let these bikers have this place. They couldn't let them take over. And it wasn't just about Golden Valley. It was about sending a message that the truckers wouldn't be intimidated anymore. They had to stand together, or they would lose everything. The door to the diner opened, and a young driver stepped inside, his face pale. He looked around, his eyes wide with fear, but his voice was steady. "They're circling the lot," he said, his words low. "I saw them. They're marking every exit, every route." The room grew quieter, the tension rising. The reality of what they were dealing with started to sink in. The bikers weren't just taking over a truck stop, they were taking over a critical part of the network. And if they could take Golden Valley, they would have a foothold that could stretch across the highways, across the entire trucking community. Jack knew they couldn't let that happen. He stood up from his rig, his boots hitting the pavement with a decisive thud. The time for waiting was over. It was time to make a stand. But he wasn't going to do it alone. This wasn't just his fight. It was everyone's. The truckers at Golden Valley had always looked out for each other. They had always had each other's backs on the road, through thick and thin. This wasn't going to be any different. Jack was already reaching out, his mind running through the connections, the network of drivers who had fought in every corner of this country, who had fought for each other on the highways and beyond. If the Steel Serpents thought they could walk in here and take control, they had another thing coming. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out quickly, seeing the name of his old friend, Bobby Chen, pop up on the screen. "You ready, Jack?" Bobby's voice was steady, calm, but there was a sense of urgency underneath. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "I'm ready. We can't let them have it, Bobby. Not Golden Valley. Not this time." Bobby didn't hesitate. "We're on our way," he said, and just like that, Jack knew the cavalry was coming. As Jack hung up, he turned back toward the diner, his gaze shifting toward the bikers who were still sitting, still watching. But now there was a shift. It wasn't just fear in the eyes of the regulars, it was resolve. They weren't just sitting there anymore. They were preparing for what was coming. Some of them were already texting, making calls, reaching out to other drivers, other truck stops. The word was spreading. Golden Valley wasn't going to be taken without a fight. The next few minutes passed in a tense silence, broken only by the hum of the CB radio, the occasional murmur of conversation, and the constant, unrelenting rumble of motorcycle engines. Jack stood by his rig, his mind focused, his hands steady. He wasn't waiting for the bikers to make the first move. He had learned long ago that the best way to win a fight was to be the one who made the first move, and right now he was ready to take the fight to them. The bikers had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they could take over Golden Valley, but they hadn't counted on one thing. This was a community of truckers, and a community was something you didn't mess with, not without facing the consequences. The sound of engines approaching again broke the stillness, but this time it wasn't just a few bikes pulling into the lot. It was a convoy of trucks, coming in from every direction. The veterans were arriving one by one, each rig pulling into position, blocking off exits, surrounding the biker's spot with precision. Jack's heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of knowing that this was the moment they had all been waiting for. The bikers weren't going to walk in and take control of Golden Valley. Not today. Not as long as there were truckers willing to stand together and fight for it. As the trucks parked, their engines rumbling in unison, the bikers looked up, their faces registering the shift in power. They had underestimated the trucking community, thinking they were dealing with a bunch of isolated individuals, each man for himself. But the bikers hadn't seen what Jack had seen, the way the truckers had come together, the way they had silently made the decision to fight back. And now it was too late. The game had changed, and the Steel Serpents were no longer in control of this lot. The truckers were, and they were ready to defend it. The pressure in the air was palpable, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The bikers, who had once been so confident in their posture, now seemed to be shifting, glancing over their shoulders as more trucks rolled into the lot. They hadn't expected this. They had underestimated Golden Valley, thinking it was just another quiet stop on the highway, another place they could control by sheer force. But this wasn't just any stop. This was a crossroads for the trucking community, a place where drivers who had been through wars, both literal and figurative, could rely on each other. Jack Reeves had known from the start that it was only a matter of time before things escalated. He had been prepared for this, mentally and emotionally. What the Steel Serpents didn't understand was that the trucking world wasn't just about the road. It was about the people who lived and breathed it. And the people at Golden Valley weren't going to roll over without a fight. The bikers had arrived in numbers, thinking they could intimidate the regulars into submission, but the response had been immediate, subtle, and unrelenting. The lot, once filled with scattered trucks, had transformed into something resembling a battlefield, albeit one where the weapons were diesel engines and the fight was for more than just territory. It was about standing together, about protecting something far more important than any one individual. It was about the integrity of the community, the kind of brotherhood that had been built over years on the road. Sarah's eyes had never left the bikers. She knew how this would play out. She had seen it in the military, seen it in the streets. The bikers weren't just some random gang. They were organized, but so were the truckers. And if the bikers thought they could take over Golden Valley without a fight, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The bikers had made their first mistake by underestimating the power of the trucking community, and they had made their second by coming here to Golden Valley, a place where the heart of the highway community beat strongest. Jack had made it clear with his calm, focused demeanor that this wasn't just his fight, it was a collective fight. The truckers weren't isolated. They were a network, a web of drivers spread across the country, bound together by shared experiences, by the miles they had traveled, the struggles they had faced, and the camaraderie they had built on the road. And now, with the bikers thinking they had the upper hand, the truckers were about to show them just what true unity could accomplish. Jack's fingers curled tighter around the steering wheel as the sounds of rumbling engines grew louder in the distance. The Steel Serpents were preparing for something. He didn't know exactly what, but he could feel the shift. The bikers were regrouping, and it wouldn't be long before they made their next move. He had spent years in the military, spent countless hours studying the art of war, and it was clear to him that the bikers were about to test the limits of what they could get away with. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen, not without a fight, not on his watch. As the motorcycles roared to life again, Jack stood, stepping out of his rig and into the cooling evening air. The lot was now filled with trucks, some parked haphazardly, others lined up in formation, blocking every potential escape route. The drivers who had been trickling in all day now seemed to understand what was at stake. They weren't just truckers, they were soldiers, and they had a mission. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from Bobby Chen. "We're here. Just give the word." Jack didn't have to say anything else. The word had already been given. The time to wait was over. He had already mapped out his plan, and now it was time to set it in motion. The Steel Serpents had underestimated the truckers, thinking they were isolated, thinking they could pick them off one by one. But the bikers had never dealt with a force like this, a force that wasn't going to scatter at the first sign of trouble. The truckers were going to stand together, and that's what made them unstoppable. As the bikers continued to gather, Jack turned to the others in the lot. "It's time," he said, his voice low but steady. "Let's show them what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The drivers nodded, understanding without words. They had been on the road for years, seen it all, and knew exactly what needed to be done. It wasn't about fighting. It was about making sure the bikers understood that they couldn't take what didn't belong to them. This was their turf, their home, and they weren't going to let anyone push them out. The trucks revved to life, engines roaring in unison, and the lot shifted into motion as the drivers began to maneuver their rigs with military precision. They weren't going to wait for the bikers to make their move. The truckers were taking control. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had changed. No longer were the truckers sitting quietly, trying to decide what to do. The bikers were no longer the ones in charge. The truckers were united now, determined and ready. The air was thick with anticipation, and Sarah couldn't help but notice the change. It wasn't just about the trucks or the drivers. It was about the spirit of the community, the strength that came from years of shared hardship, of knowing that no matter how tough things got, you could always count on the person next to you. And that strength was about to make itself known. The Steel Serpents had gathered in their corner of the diner, but the noise had died down. There was still laughter, but it lacked the same bite it had earlier. Razor, who had been the picture of confidence when he first arrived, now seemed to be watching the lot more intently, his eyes flicking from the trucks to the drivers. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he could feel the change in the air. The bikers had started to realize that they weren't dealing with just a few truckers. They were dealing with an entire community that was more than ready to fight back. And then the trucks moved. They didn't roar forward all at once, but each truck strategically took its place, positioning itself between the bikers and the exits, blocking any potential escape routes. Razor's eyes flicked from truck to truck, his jaw tightening as he realized the scale of what was happening. This wasn't just a few drivers standing together. This was an organized resistance, a force so well coordinated that the bikers found themselves at the center of a carefully constructed trap. Razor's lip curled in frustration. He had miscalculated. Jack watched as the Steel Serpents began to grow agitated, their movements jerky, unsure. They had thought they were the ones in control. They had assumed that the truckers would back down at the first sign of trouble. But they had underestimated the unity that ran through the trucking community. They had underestimated the resolve of the people who lived and worked on the highways. The Steel Serpents had pushed too far, and now it was time for the truckers to make their stand. But as the bikers started to move, trying to regroup and reassess, they were met with the unmistakable sound of more engines, the rumbling of backup. The truckers weren't alone. Word had spread quickly, and the community was responding. The bikers' numbers, once so imposing, were now dwarfed by the sheer volume of trucks that had pulled in from all directions. They had come to support, to back up their fellow drivers, to make sure that Golden Valley wasn't taken without a fight. The bikers, who had thought they were the only ones who knew how to organize, now found themselves surrounded by a force they couldn't have predicted. It was no longer just about muscle. It was about something far stronger, a community that had come together to defend its own. Razor's eyes widened as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. The bikers had spread themselves too thin, and now they were surrounded. The trucks formed a perimeter around them, each driver poised and ready. The bikers were trapped, unable to move without running into a sea of diesel engines and steel. It was a standoff, but this time the truckers were the ones holding all the cards. Razor, once so confident, now looked uncertain, his hand twitching toward his side as if contemplating the next move. But the truckers weren't going to give him the chance. Jack watched the scene unfold, his mind already working through the next steps. This wasn't just a battle for control of Golden Valley, it was a statement, a declaration that the highways belonged to the people who lived on them, who worked them, and who understood them better than anyone else. This was their world, and the steel serpents had made the mistake of thinking they could take it from them. The silence that had descended on the parking lot was broken only by the hum of engines and the heavy breathing of the bikers, who now found themselves with nowhere to go. They were surrounded, and the realization that they had pushed too far was settling in. Jack wasn't going to let them take Golden Valley, not without a fight, and not without showing them just what it meant to mess with the wrong community. The standoff at Golden Valley was reaching its peak. The steel serpents had made their move, but now they were being tested in ways they hadn't expected. What had begun as an intimidating show of force, a display of dominance meant to break the truckers and take control, was rapidly spiraling into a battle they hadn't prepared for. The bikers had underestimated the unity of the trucking community. They hadn't realized that Golden Valley wasn't just another truck stop. It was a hub, a vital part of a network that stretched across the highways, connecting drivers from all corners of the country. And the people who called this place home were more than just truckers. They were a family. The bikers, who had swaggered in with their leather jackets and hard looks, now found themselves surrounded by a growing wall of steel. The trucks, parked with military precision, were forming an impenetrable barrier around them. They had nowhere to go. Jack watched the bikers closely, his mind working through the possibilities. Razor, their leader, was pacing now, his confidence cracking as the realization set in that the tables had turned. He had thought this would be easy, that he and his gang could take over this small truck stop, intimidate the drivers, and leave without resistance. But they hadn't counted on the bond that truckers shared, the unspoken code that bound them together, no matter the odds. Jack had been in tight spots before. He had faced enemies far more dangerous than a group of bikers, but nothing had prepared him for the kind of unity he was seeing now. The bikers had no idea how to handle it. They were used to dividing and conquering, to instilling fear and breaking down defenses. But here, in this parking lot, they were facing a different kind of resistance, one that wasn't built on fear. It was built on trust, on shared experience, on the knowledge that when push came to shove, they would stand together no matter the cost. As the bikers began to grow more agitated, Jack knew that this wasn't going to end quietly. There was no way the steel serpents would simply pack up and leave, not without trying to prove something, not without testing the limits of the truckers' resolve. The engine noise from the trucks around him was like a low hum, a steady reminder that the power was now in their hands. This wasn't a one-on-one confrontation anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about the road, the highways that crisscrossed the country, connecting every town, every city. This was about protecting those who lived and worked on them, about making sure that no one, no gang, no corporation could come in and take what they had built. Razor's frustration was palpable as he stepped away from his crew, his eyes scanning the lot, trying to figure out how to get out of the trap they had walked into. The bikers were used to controlling the space they occupied, to moving freely through areas that others had ceded to them. But now they were boxed in, unable to move without running into a rig or another truck. The once feared gang was losing their edge, their arrogance beginning to slip away. Jack wasn't in a hurry. He knew the bikers were on the brink of making a mistake, and that's when he would strike. The most important thing was to stay calm, stay in control. It wasn't about attacking. It was about maintaining the upper hand, about making sure the bikers knew they couldn't intimidate their way out of this. Across the lot, the other truckers were silently taking their positions, ready for whatever would come next. They weren't shouting, weren't making any moves. They were waiting for the bikers to make their next move. That was the key. The truckers had learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to wait, to allow the enemy to act first and then capitalize on their mistakes. The Steel Serpents had played their cards, had made their threats, but they were running out of options. They were cornered now, and no amount of bluster or intimidation was going to change that. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had changed completely. The once boisterous laughter of the bikers had quieted, replaced by murmurs and looks of unease as the reality of the situation started to sink in. Sarah moved behind the counter, her movements efficient but careful. She wasn't just managing the diner anymore. She was keeping track of every trucker, every movement, every shift in the atmosphere. The truckers weren't just watching the bikers, they were watching each other, making sure they were all on the same page. This wasn't just a fight for Golden Valley. This was a statement, a declaration that they wouldn't back down, that no one would ever take this community or the spirit behind it without a fight. Outside, Jack could see more trucks arriving, each one pulling into the lot with precision, taking up their designated positions, adding to the growing blockade. The bikers were losing their swagger, realizing that they were running out of time, out of space. It wasn't just the trucks that had surrounded them, it was the resolve of the drivers, the veterans who had been on the road for years, who knew what it meant to fight for what mattered. They weren't backing down. Not today. Jack's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Bobby. "Feds are coming through. They've got the intel. This is bigger than we thought." Jack took a deep breath. This was it. The bikers had made their move, but now the law was on their side, and the entire operation was about to unravel. The steel grip of tension that had held the parking lot in a vice was slowly starting to ease as law enforcement moved in, bringing with them the firepower and authority to put an end to this once and for all. But the real victory wasn't going to come from the feds. It was going to come from the truckers, from their refusal to be intimidated, from their willingness to stand firm when it mattered most. The bikers were still reeling from the shock of being outmaneuvered. Razor, his face flushed with frustration, turned to his crew, barking orders under his breath, trying to regain control of the situation. But the bikers were scattered now, unsure of what to do. They were no longer the ones in control. They had overplayed their hand, and now they were trapped in a situation they couldn't get out of. As the first law enforcement vehicles pulled into the lot, the sound of sirens cutting through the air, the Steel Serpents were forced to face the reality of their situation. They had miscalculated, and now they were going to pay the price. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the bikers retreat, their swagger replaced by uncertainty. They had come here with one goal, to take over Golden Valley, to claim it as their own, but they had failed. They hadn't accounted for the truckers, for the community that called this place home. And as the first handcuffs clicked into place, the victory was clear. The Steel Serpents had lost. They had underestimated the strength of the people they thought they could control. The sound of the last motorcycle fading into the distance felt like a victory in itself. The tension in the lot started to ease as the truckers exchanged nods and glances. The battle was over. Golden Valley had been defended. The community had stood strong, and now, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lot, the truckers knew they had made a statement. This wasn't just a win for them. It was a message to anyone who thought they could come in and take what didn't belong to them. The highways were theirs, and anyone who tried to mess with that would have to deal with the consequences. As Jack stood there, watching the last of the bikers leave, a sense of calm settled over him. He had known this fight was coming. He had known it would take everything the trucking community had to offer. But in the end, it wasn't about fighting. It was about standing firm, standing together, and showing the world that when the truckers came together, there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Jack knew that. He knew that the steel serpents were just the beginning, that there would be others, more dangerous, more calculated, who would come after Golden Valley. But for now, the message had been sent. The highways were theirs, and they weren't giving them up without a fight.